There's a specific kind of parent who will drive 3 hours in a snowstorm to help you move apartments, but never once said, "I love you" while you were growing up. A parent who shows up without being asked, fixes things without being thanked, and somehow always knows when something is wrong, but can't quite sit down and have a feelings conversation. If you were raised by someone born between 1965 and 1980, you probably recognize this. And if you are that parent, you probably recognize it too, even if you've never put words to it. This is the generation that psychologists and sociologists are only now beginning to study in earnest as parents, not as teenagers, not as the workforce, but as people raising children in the 21st century while carrying something from the 20th that most of them never fully unpacked. The easy assumption is that Gen X parents are simply emotionally unavailable, that they're cold or distant, or that they repeat patterns passed down from their own parents. And on the surface, that reading seems reasonable. Gen X was famously raised with what researchers call low parental supervision, latchkey kids, home alone after school, parents who worked, who divorced at historically high rates, who lived through economic instability and cultural upheaval, and largely told their children to figure it out. The assumption follows naturally. A generation that didn't receive warmth in a conventional way would struggle to give it. But that's not quite what the research shows, and it's not what you see when you look more carefully at how these individuals actually parent. What's happening is more psychologically interesting than simple repetition of pattern. When a person grows up in an environment where emotional expression was inconsistent or absent, the brain doesn't simply learn to stop feeling, it learns to reroute. The limbic system, which processes emotion, doesn't shut down, it adapts. It finds different pathways to express attachment, and one of the most documented of those pathways runs directly through action, through doing rather than saying. There's a concept in attachment research sometimes called behavioral caregiving, where affection and love get expressed primarily through functional behavior rather than verbal or physical warmth. Fixing the car, making the food, showing up. These aren't substitutes for love in the minds of people who express this way. They are the love. The neural circuitry involved in caregiving behavior overlaps significantly with the circuitry involved in emotional bonding. The same reward systems that activate during moments of closeness can be triggered through acts of provision and protection. For Gen X parents, that circuitry was shaped early, and it was shaped by an environment that didn't reward open emotional expression the way later generations came to expect. This isn't a flaw in wiring, it's an adaptation to the world they grew up in. A 2017 study examining attachment styles across generational cohorts found that adults who experienced inconsistent parental warmth in childhood were significantly more likely to develop what the researchers called avoidant-adjacent attachment patterns, not because they attached less deeply, but because their attachment expressed itself differently. They were more likely to equate care with reliability, with presence, with practical action. They were less likely to feel comfortable with sustained emotional vulnerability, not because they lacked the capacity, but because that particular register of expression was never normalized for them. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Gen X is also the first generation in Western psychological research to show a significant internal split between what they received and what they consciously chose to provide. Studies on intergenerational parenting behavior typically find that people parent much the way they were parented, with small variations at the margins. The pattern tends to replicate. But Gen X shows a measurable deviation from this. Many Gen X parents actively, consciously rejected specific elements of their upbringing while unknowingly carrying others forward. They said, "I will not make my child feel invisible the way I did," and they largely kept that promise. They are statistically more involved in their children's daily lives than their own parents were. But the emotional language, the vocabulary of feelings openly named and discussed, that part remained harder to inherit because you can't inherit something that was never modeled. So what you end up with is a parent who will miss sleep to help you, who notices when you're struggling before you say anything, who carries your stress as their own, but who might go completely quiet when you try to tell them you're sad, or who responds to emotional disclosure with a practical solution rather than a pause and a question. Not because they don't care, because they were trained by their own childhood environment to understand care as something you do, not something you declare. The prefrontal cortex, the region involved in emotional regulation and social processing, continues developing well into a person's mid-20s and is profoundly shaped by early experience. The relational templates formed in childhood don't disappear in adulthood. They get refined, sometimes challenged, but the baseline remains. For someone who spent formative years reading emotional environments carefully because safety sometimes depended on it, that hypervigilance doesn't simply turn off when they become a parent. It often redirects into a form of intense, watchful love that can feel smothering to a child who doesn't understand it and invisible to one who is hoping for something more openly tender. This doesn't mean Gen X parents are damaged. That doesn't make them less loving than the parents who cry freely at school plays or narrate every feeling aloud. It simply suggests that the architecture of their emotional expression was built under different conditions, and architecture is hard to renovate without first understanding what the original structure was built to withstand. There's something else worth noting. Gen X came of age in a cultural moment defined by skepticism. They watched institutions fail. They saw sincerity get mocked. They absorbed a cultural message that vulnerability was a liability, that needing too much was weakness, that self-sufficiency was the only reliable currency. The oxytocin-driven behaviors associated with open emotional bonding, the hugging, the affirming, the verbal reassurance, these weren't absent from their world. They just carried a complicated cultural weight, and some of that weight got passed on, quietly, not through words, but through the particular ways silence was held in a room. What this produces in the children of Gen X parents is often a strange kind of emotional detective work, learning to read love in actions instead of words, understanding that a parent who reorganizes your pantry without asking is not being controlling, but is trying, imperfectly, to take care of you. Recognizing that "let me know if you need anything" is in the emotional language of this generation sometimes the equivalent of "I love you and I'm scared for you and I don't know what to do with that." The unexpected psychological insight here is this: the children who grew up learning to decode love rather than receive it directly often become remarkably attuned readers of other people. The same perceptive skill that was necessary to navigate a home where warmth was expressed obliquely becomes in adulthood a form of emotional intelligence that's harder to develop when everything is stated plainly. This doesn't mean the original dynamic is ideal. It suggests that what looks like deprivation from one angle can sometimes produce something quietly valuable from another. What the psychology of Gen X parenting ultimately reveals is something broader about how love adapts to circumstance. The capacity for attachment in humans is remarkably durable. It finds ways through. It changes shape depending on what the environment allows, what the culture rewards, what the nervous system learned to expect. Gen X parents didn't love less. They loved in the language available to them, in a dialect built from self-reliance and watchfulness and the particular kind of devotion that shows up without fanfare. If you've spent years trying to understand a parent who felt both deeply present and somehow unreachable, that tension is real, and it has a name, it has a history, and it's not a verdict on how much you were loved. It's simply the evidence of how complicated love becomes when it travels through a generation that was never quite taught to speak it plainly. If this kind of analysis resonated with you, you'll probably connect with the psychology behind why emotionally self-sufficient people struggle most in close relationships and what that says about the attachment styles we carry without realizing it.